At the edge of a medieval city lies a grim stone building. Its doors are bolted from the outside, and inside, rows of straw-filled pallets line the walls. On top of each one of them lies a victim of the Black Death, feverish, sweating and covered in blackened swellings, gasping for breath. The air is thick with smoke from fires lit to purify the contagion, mingling in with the stench of sickness. In one corner stands a solitary physician in a long gown tending to a patient, while another nun murmurs prayers over one who has just expired. The reality of a plague hospital. In these halls, life and death hung in a fragile balance, and for the patients who entered, seeking aid, and for the caregivers who risked their lives daily, the plague hospital was a place of last hope, but ultimate despair. So, if you'd like to go there, if you have the stomach for it, we can spend the next hour talking about life and death in a plague hospital. Quarantine centers of medieval times, doing everything they could with the technology and knowledge they had, however limited it was. Allow me to welcome you to the channel first. Hello to any newcomers. Good to meet you, and if you want to subscribe, well, it's only a click away. And I will remind everyone on here that the entire channel is ad-free, a sanctuary on YouTube, away from all of the mid-rolls and all of those, frankly, disturbing advertisements that I see lately on YouTube. We hate them as much as you do, so we've decided to just not have them. We are, however, supported financially on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through Super Thanks and the PayPal link in the channel description and pinned comment, and also the merch store, which has a good amount of little goodies there if you're interested in that. But your best support is word of mouth. Tell your friends, family, co-workers, hell, tell your enemies as well. Maybe you'll turn them into friends, common interests, who knows? In any case, do the whole like, comment, subscribe thing, you know what it's like. But with all that out of the way, introduction said and done, shameful e-begging out of the way, let us begin our topic today, life and death in a plague hospital. So, the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, we all know about it. It ravaged Europe with unprecedented fury. Everyone around at the time suddenly thought it was the end of the world, really. But by the end of the pandemic, well, the time it had run its course, anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population was well and truly dead. Entire cities were decimated, and normal life ground to a halt. In the face of such a cataclysm, conventional medical practices and charities were understandably overwhelmed. Chroniclers of the time describe how quickly the plague struck and how unprepared communities were. Let's look at Florence in Italy, for example. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio observed in 1348 that so many fell ill simultaneously that brother abandoned brother, wives abandoned their husbands, and even more horrifying, mothers abandoned their own children rather than risk contagion. And it certainly was no exaggeration either. No poetic or dramatic license needed. It was truly the depths of human misery. Well, people with means, there was a bit of a different situation. They could flee to the countryside, while the poor often had no choice but to stay put in the plague-stricken cities and towns. As a result of all this, thousands of victims perished at home devoid of help or care, their bodies sometimes left unburied until the smell of decay alerted neighbors. These accounts show why plague hospitals became desperately needed. Something had to be done, after all. And so, In the mid-14th century, you must understand that Europe did not yet have specialized infectious disease hospitals. Medieval hospitals did exist, but they were mostly religious foundations meant to house the poor, or places to care for the sick and pilgrims in general. But when the Black Death hit, that had to change. Some of these facilities were repurposed to isolate and treat plague victims. Churches, monasteries, and guild halls were converted into emergency infirmaries. Let's take Venice, for instance. Authorities reacting to the 1348 outbreak arranged for the sick poor to be taken to hospitals. They even set up ships to ferry the dead to mass graves on a nearby island, certainly killing the local real estate price, I'm sure. No one really going there anymore, aren't they? Well, the idea was to keep the plague victims separate from the healthy population as much as possible. Whether they really knew it, they were engaging in quarantine. A little bit of germ theory. It was the old miasma theory back then. They were kind of on the right track. Kind of doing the best they could, like we said, with the technology and knowledge of the time. Now, the term pest house came into use, meaning a place to segregate those afflicted with the pestilence. These early plague hospitals were often improvised and quite rudimentary, but they did represent a new approach to the public health crisis, and that's communal care, combined with quarantine. Over time, European cities learned from these early efforts and began to establish more formal plague hospitals. One of the first examples of a dedicated plague hospital can be traced to the Adriatic port city of Ragusa, which, by the way, is modern-day Dubrovnik, in the late 14th century. Ragusa, after suffering repeated plague outbreaks, instituted a quarantine law in 1377. This required newcomers to isolate on a nearby island before entering the city. Soon after, they set up temporary plague hospitals on the island of Milet to care for infected travelers and residents in isolation. The approach was a mix of compassion and caution. To treat the sick, sure, but in a location far from the urban population. Now, the Italian word for a 30-day isolation, Trentino, evolved into quarantino for a 40-day period, thus coining the term quarantine. By the early 15th century, Venice followed suit on a bit of a larger scale. In 1423, Venice had established the first permanent plague hospital on an island in its lagoon, the Lazaretto Vecchio, Old Lazaretto. Now, it's interesting, this very name, Lazaretto, likely comes from the nickname of this island, Santa Maria di Nazareth, and it became the generic term for plague hospitals across Europe. These institutions were part hospital and part isolation ward. They signaled the realization that managing plague required collective measures. From Italy, the concept of plague hospitals spread to other parts of Europe over the 15th and 16th centuries. Municipal authorities in France, the Low Countries, and England all eventually developed their own pest houses when plague struck. By the 17th century, during later outbreaks like the Great Plague of London in 1665, or the Marseille Plague of 1720, plague hospitals had become a regular feature of urban emergency planning. Yet, it was the Black Death that truly forced their inception. In the crucible of 1348 to 1350, the basic template was set. Find a space away from the healthy, gather up all the sick, put them in there, and try to care for them as best as you could. So, from here we're going to explore what life was like within those spaces, for the afflicted who entered the doors, and for the brave and sometimes simply desperate souls who staffed them. So what was the experience like for a patient inside one of these hospitals? where the conditions varied by place and period. But one thing was common: the grim reality. It was not a nice place to be. I don't think anyone needs to have a historical degree to make that claim. Well, upon entering, a plague victim would typically find themselves in a large hall or a series of small wards set up in an emptied building. Some plague hospitals were located in disused monasteries or city outskirts, barns hastily converted for the purpose. The surroundings were often austere. Walls might be whitewashed with lime, since lime was thought to purify miasmas, and windows thrown open or broken out for ventilation. If the season was cold, charcoal braziers or bonfires burned, as it believed that smoke would cleanse the poisoned air of the plague. The patients would lie on simple beds or piles of hay. In better organized hospitals, each patient got a wooden bed frame with a mattress, clean sheets, and a blanket, an approach recommended by some physicians who argued that fresh air and clean bedding gave the sick a better chance to recover. Well, in more makeshift pest houses, however, resources were scant, and many patients might lie on straw mats on the floor, covered only by the cloaks that they brought with them, which of course were already covered in germs and all the rest. Now, the patients themselves were in agony, and there wasn't much that they could do to relieve that. The classic form of the bubonic plague struck with sudden force: high fever, chills, and exhaustion, followed by the appearance of buboes, that is, painful swollen lymph nodes, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. Many also suffered from internal bleeding that could turn their skin dark, hence the Black Death, that's why they called it that, and also foul-smelling breath as the infection coursed through them. Within a plague hospital ward, one would hear the incessant coughing and sometimes the ominous sound of victims spitting blood, a sign of the often fatal pneumonic form of the plague which infected the lungs. The atmosphere was a mix of moans, prayers, and delirious rantings and ravings. A 14th century observer in France noted that some sufferers became delusional with fever, crying out or wandering around if not restrained. In these conditions, the comfort of the patients depended greatly on the staff and supplies. Some hospitals had basic amenities, a continual supply of water, maybe herbal infusions to drink, and bread or broth to eat if the patients could stomach it, that is. Nourishing food was considered part of the therapy. One Italian plague ordinance suggested feeding the ill good meat and strong wine to bolster their strength. In any case, probably the wine helped deal with the pain of it all. Now, during the worst epidemics, food itself could be scarce, and those in isolated plague hospitals might receive only meager rations. Very easy for people to be forgotten about, especially with the pressure of that job. And you can certainly imagine the fear that accompanied being sent to a plague hospital. In an era before any effective cures, many saw these places as way stations on the journey to death. And indeed, by the time a patient was sick enough to be taken to a pest house, their chances of survival were pretty slim. Accounts from the time often refer to plague hospitals as final refuges for the desperate. However, it wasn't all bad news. There were certainly survivors. Not every patient died. Some recovered and walked out, which must have been moments of profound joy and astonishment, I'm sure you can understand. In the plague of 1720, in Marseille, for example, records show that nearly half of the patients admitted to the city's 2 plague hospitals eventually recovered. Well, this hints that with shelter, food, and care, outcomes could improve slightly over leaving people untended in their homes. But we're mainly sticking to the mid-14th century Black Death here, where such statistics were hard to come by. I'm afraid the feel-good stories will have to wait for another video, though you probably didn't expect many feel-good stories from this video. Well, the focus of that time period, the mid-14th century, was simply on containing chaos. But for most patients, daily life in the pest house was a strange limbo. They were separated from family and the outside world. Communication with loved ones, if it happened at all, was done from a distance. Perhaps a family member might come and shout inquiries from behind a fence or across a field, but direct contact was usually forbidden. Personal belongings were often burned or left behind upon admission to avoid bringing contaminated items in. The patient might be given a tunic or gown provided by the hospital. In some well-run facilities, each patient's few possessions, coins, jewelry, clothing, were inventoried and perhaps fumigated and stored, to be returned if they recovered, or to be claimed by their family if they did not. Sadly, in the more disorganized or unscrupulous places, a sick person's goods might simply just be stolen. Well, being in a plague hospital meant entrusting oneself to the care of strangers at a time of extreme vulnerability. And you can imagine this, right? If you're one of the workers there and day by day things get worse, and you're thinking, I'm just waiting for my time when the buboes appear on me, you could certainly imagine a few people thinking, well, all those wealthy people fled to the countryside. I'm not wealthy, so I can't flee to the countryside, but I could become wealthy if I stole all of this jewelry and gold, whatever it is, from the coffers of the storage, and just use that to flee. A cut and run. I'll just not show up to work tomorrow. You could certainly imagine that happening. Of course, not advocating for that sort of thing. In any case, admitting yourself to one of these pest houses required tremendous faith, or perhaps tremendous desperation, and more often than not it was the desperation that drove people there. Many others likely died at home without ever reaching a hospital, either by choice or lack of opportunity. Those who did come had at least a chance, slim as it was, at receiving nursing and maybe treatment. But if the plight of the patients was dire, the situation of those who cared for them was scarcely less so. The doctors, surgeons, nurses, orderlies, grave diggers, and the clergy too, who entered the Plague Hospital were truly on the front lines. In the Black Death era, many physicians and priests simply ran away. They abandoned cities in droves when the mortality mounted, as numerous chroniclers attest to. But a few notable ones remained and stepped forward to help. One famous example is Guy de Chauliac, the personal physician to the Pope in Avignon, France. When plague hit Avignon in 1348, most of his fellow doctors ran away or sealed themselves in their homes. Chauliac, however, continued to visit and treat the sick, observing the disease closely. He even caught the plague himself, likely a bubonic infection, but he managed to survive it. His writings described in clinical detail the symptoms he acknowledges and the immense contagion, noting that merely standing near a victim could seem to transmit it. Chauliac's dedication meant that at least the papal court, well, some medical care would persist for them. He later wrote of the Great Death lasting 7 months in Avignon, and distinguished the fast-killing pneumonic form, often fatal in 3 days, from the bubonic form, commonly killing in 5. His survival was quite rare. Many who tried to help were not so fortunate. And so in the plague hospitals across Europe, the caregivers often included members of religious orders. Monks, nuns, driven by faith and duty, they were among the few willing to consistently nurse the infected. Their motivation was typically charity, the ideal of imitatio Christi, imitating Christ by caring for the sick and poor. Yet, this charity exacted a heavy price. Entire convents and monasteries suffered decimation after tending plague victims. For example, in England, the Hospital of St. James at Westminster, a religious house that also functioned as an infirmary, was completely devastated during the Black Death. Historical records indicate that all of the brethren and sisters of St. James Hospital died in 1349, except for one. The sole survivor, a man named William de Weston, was left to run the hospital alone, and was officially appointed as its guardian as after the plague passed. Even several years later, the institution remained effectively empty because so few staff were left. Similar stories come from other places. The hospital of Sandown in Surrey lost every member of its community to plague, leaving not a single soul to tend it. In many towns, priests who administered last rites, or nuns who fed the sick, did so day after day until they themselves collapsed. An anonymous cleric in Avignon wrote in 1348 of this tragic pattern, observing that, quote, "A large number of persons have died merely through their affection for others, for they might have escaped had they not, moved by piety and Christian charity, visited the sick at the time." Not all caregivers or clergy were volunteers, though. Some were actually paid by city authorities. As time went on, cities realized that special incentives were needed to recruit people to work in the pest house. Higher wages, hazard pay, and even promise of rewards or honors were offered. In Venice, after the 1348 outbreak, the government publicly praised and awarded doctors who remained faithful to their posts during the emergency. These physicians received diplomas of merit, and records speak of how death struck so quickly that many doctors perished soon after tending their first cases. The city of Florence, during a later plague in 1630, had to entice barbers and healers to serve in the lazaretto, because most formally trained doctors were either dead or just too frightened. Of course, things changed. By the 17th century, some cities appointed official plague doctors, individuals whose sole job was to treat the plague victims. Well, these doctors often were outsiders, sometimes young physicians looking to make a name for themselves, or low-tier practitioners who agreed to work for a set fee. In London's 1665 plague, for example, the city and parishes hired nurses, often poor women, to attend to the victims in quarantined houses or pest houses, and then searchers to inspect bodies and certify plague deaths. These jobs carried stigma and danger, but in a time of crisis, the usual social order broke down, and new roles emerged. Working in a plague hospital was a terrifying assignment. Caregivers had to balance compassion with self-protection, in an era where the cause of the plague was not truly understood. The prevailing theory blamed miasma, poisonous bad air, and person-to-person contagion through corruption of vapors or bodily excretions. Therefore, those tending the sick took what precautions they knew. They might wear long robes or cloaks, and cover their faces with cloths soaked in aromatic vinegar or camphor. In later years, the image of the plague doctor with a bird-like beaked mask became iconic. This costume was invented in the 17th century, often credited to Charles de Lorme, physician to the French court. The beak of the mask was filled with sweet-smelling herbs and spices to filter the air, and the doctor wore gloves, boots, and a waxed canvas overcoat, along with a wide-brimmed hat. They even carried a rod to avoid touching patients directly, or perhaps to ward off desperate delirious victims. While this full costume did not exist during the Black Death itself, the conception of personal protective measures was present even then. Medieval accounts mention doctors carrying posies of flowers, or burning incense as they moved among the sick to avoid the corrupted air. Some wore amulets or charms for divine protection. Despite all these measures, though, the truth was that prolonged close contact with plague victims was extremely dangerous, until modern antibiotics came in. and I'm afraid the doctors in the 14th century would have to wait quite a long time for that. Ultimately, the caregivers often realized that their own lives were at risk. And then there's the emotional toll on the plague hospital staff. That cannot be overstated. They witnessed death constantly. One day's work might involve lancing a patient's buboes to try to drain poisons, a painful procedure done with crude surgical knives, and then shrouding the bodies of those who died overnight. Nurses had to change linens thick with sweat and blood, and remove the deceased quickly to prevent the smell and corruption from spreading. Many workers were pushed beyond the normal limits of endurance. An observer from Milan in 1630 described hospital attendants who barely slept, subsisting on whatever food they could grab, overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients. Some coped by a kind of grim resignation that their fate was in the hands of God. Others perhaps became numb to the suffering as a survival mechanism. We also have hints of less honorable behavior. For instance, later commentators accused some 17th century plague nurses of negligence or even cruelty. There were dark rumors that a few unscrupulous nurses hastened the death of wealthy patients to plunder their belongings. Daniel Defoe's chronicle of the 1665 London plague, though written later as part of historical fiction, mentions stories of nurses who, for the love of gain, smothered patients or stole their goods from homes under the guise of infection control. Such accounts suggest that not every caregiver was a saint. Among those drawn to the job by money, there were bound to be some taking advantage. However, the tales, whether true or exaggerated, are the exception. Most men and women working in the plague hospitals were genuinely trying to help amid this medical apocalypse, often at great personal cost. Now, medical science of the age was rudimentary, but that did not mean that plague hospital staff did nothing for the patients. On the contrary, they employed the best remedies and routines available, according to contemporary knowledge. A typical day in a plague hospital would begin with rounds of the physician if one was present, or the head caretaker. They would move from bed to bed, observing who was alive, who needed urgent attention, and who had died during the night. Those still alive might be given treatments such as herbal potions, or the ever-popular practice of bloodletting. Many doctors believe that removing a small quantity of corrupted blood could balance the humors and alleviate the disease. Guy de Chauliac himself recommended bleeding patients in certain cases, though it had to be done early in the illness to have any hope of benefit. Another common intervention was the lancing of buboes. Since the swellings were agonizing and often filled with pus, some surgeons thought that cutting them open to drain the pus could help the patient recover. Accounts from the Italian plague manuals advise carefully about incising the bubo with a knife, then applying a poultice, a warm, moist concoction often made with bread, onions, or herbs to draw out the poison. For instance, one recipe involved a paste of figs, onions, yeast, and butter to soften and burst the bubo. Sounds like a waste of good butter, if you ask me. Well, if the swelling opened, they would drain it and cauterize it with a hot iron or apply strong vinegar, hoping to prevent further corruption. A pretty brutal procedure without any anesthesia, perhaps beyond a swig of wine. But there are cases recorded where patients apparently survived after such treatment, leading the doctors to claim success. I suppose when you've got nothing else to really go on, you just take what you can get, don't you? Well, besides these invasive methods, plague hospital practitioners relied on a wide range of medical concoctions. Theriac, a complex compound originally from ancient times containing dozens of ingredients like various herbs, opium, and even viper flesh, was treasured as a potential antidote to poison and plague. Though extremely expensive, Some hospitals did secure small amounts of theriac to administer to important patients or just as a fumigant. More commonly, simpler herbs were used. Wormwood, mint, rue, and rose were boiled to make infusions or used to scent the air. Physicians also recommended that patients drink concoctions like ground-up eggshells with vinegar, or arsenic and treacle diluted with wine. Now that's pretty desperate, isn't it? Talk about a gamble. Hygiene and comfort measures, primitive as they were, played a big role too. Attendants frequently burned fires of pine or juniper wood, believing the smoke would clear the plague. Floors might be sprinkled with vinegar or strewn with aromatic herbs like lavender and thyme to mask the odor and improve the air quality. Laundering of linens was attempted when possible. An ideal scenario, of course. The infected sheets and clothes would be boiled and replaced with fresh ones, but conditions are not always ideal. However, during the height of an outbreak, there were rarely enough fresh linens or people to wash them. Often dirty bedding simply accumulated, adding to the filth. Some hospitals had foresight to designate a separate cleaning team whose job was to remove soiled straw and replace it with clean straw bedding periodically, which could slightly reduce flea infestations, which we now know plague was commonly spread by flea bites, and those fleas thrive in dirty cloth and straw. But even without understanding the bacterium Yersinia pestis, or the role of fleas and rats, those running plague hospitals, well, they had the intuition that cleanliness and isolation were beneficial. Religious care was also part of the treatment in many plague hospitals. For those patients who were conscious and devout, having a priest or monk for spiritual comfort was crucial. In some pesthouses attached to monasteries, prayers were said daily for the sick. Priests might hear confessions through a window or with some distance if they were afraid to enter the ward directly. In the worst phases of the Black Death, though, chroniclers lament that many died without any priest to give last rites. The clergy were either too overwhelmed or just too fearful. One letter from a survivor in 1348 Avignon notes that, quote, "Nor do priests even hear the confessions nor give them the sacraments, but everyone, while still in health, looks after himself." In later centuries, this changed somewhat, as church authorities urged clergy to attend the plague hospitals as part of their duty, and some heroic priests did, knowing it likely meant martyrdom by disease. An interesting aspect of the plague hospital regimen was the attempted segregation even within the hospital. Some places tried to separate patients by category, those with less severe symptoms in one room, and the no-hopers in another, or women in one area and men in another. Children, when they were admitted, might be kept together. In any case, the idea was to manage the chaos and also possibly shield the recovering from witnessing too much death around them. For instance, in the large lazaretto of Milan during the 1630 plague, historical sources suggest that the vast compound, which held thousands, by the way, was organized into sections, with a central courtyard and chapel and different corridors for different groups. So you can imagine wardens shouting orders, nurses rushing with basins of water, perhaps an apothecary in a corner grinding ingredients for a poultice. Amid all of this, strict discipline was needed to keep the hospital from turning into an even greater source of contagion. Guards were often posted at the gates. In some cities like London in 1665, pesthouse workers themselves were not allowed to freely leave. They might be quarantined for a period even after their service, to ensure they did not carry the infection outside. Plague hospitals thus operated as microcosms of a city under siege. They had their internal rules, their unsung routines of care, and an ever-present awareness that death lurked in every corner. Of course, despite all the best efforts of those within, many who entered the plague hospital never came out. Well, at least they might have been wheeled out in the body wheelbarrow, but they didn't come out alive. Death was a daily occurrence, often a multiple times a day occurrence, and dealing with the dead was a significant part of the hospital routine. As soon as a patient succumbed, sometimes suddenly, as when a high fever turned into fatal septicemia overnight, attendants would cover the body with a sheet and remove it from the ward. The urgency was both practical and spiritual. From a health standpoint, the corpses were thought to exude poisonous vapors and spread the plague further, so it was important to get them away from the living patients. And from a religious standpoint, Christian doctrine demanded that the dead be given a proper burial, however hasty and not left to rot away. During massive epidemics, what's an epidemic? Normal funeral rites were impossible to maintain. In plague hospitals, bodies might be temporarily placed in a designated dead room. They could have found a more gentle name for it, or a shed, until they could be transported out, typically at dusk or dawn to avoid alarming the general populace. In Venice's plague hospital in 1348, the authorities arranged boat transport to carry corpses each day to an island where huge burial pits awaited. In other cities, death carts came rattling to the pest house door. The imagery of the cart piled with bodies became an iconic one of the plague years. Often a driver and a couple of helpers with their nose and mouths wrapped in rags soaked with vinegar would load the dead onto a cart. A contemporary account from Siena in 1348 by Anglo di Tura chillingly noted, quote, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world, and one man was not enough to carry the dead to the pits, so they took 2 or 3 at a time on a board." This scenario was repeated in plague hospitals where multiple victims might be carried out together for mass burial. Sometimes trenches were dug in the grounds of the hospital itself, if it was outside the city walls, making the hospital's field into a graveyard. But more often, the dead from the hospital joined the general plague pits designated by a town council. The ritual of burying was stripped down to the basics. A priest, if available, might say a quick prayer over the pit or along the road. But touching the bodies, that was avoided. Many victims were buried in the clothes they died in, or wrapped hastily in whatever sheet they were lying on. The idea of coffins was out of the question for the majority. Plague pits were common graves, layered with bodies and quick-limed to hasten decomposition. One chronicler in London during 1665 described the new churchyard, opened for plague burials where 50,000 were said to be thrown in, often without any ceremony beyond the tolling of a bell. In the medieval mindset, this lack of proper funerary care was deeply disturbing, but it became the norm under extreme conditions. It is small wonder that survivors writing later emphasized the trauma of these scenes. They had seen death on a scale that shattered the social and religious comforts of a decent burial. Within the plague hospital, the omnipresence of death had psychological impacts on both patients and staff. Patients, who were still lucid, would watch as the bed next to them was suddenly empty one morning, its occupant having died and been whisked away. They knew what the odds were. Some must have lapsed into despair, while others perhaps found a solace in a shared camaraderie. We're all in this together, that kind of spirit. There are, too, hints of compassion, even in the worst moments. A letter from a cleric in 1348 mentioned how people, despite fear, tried to leave food and water within reach of a bedridden plague sufferer's leave food and water within reach of a bedridden plague sufferer before fleeing, so the ill might not die utterly abandoned. In a plague hospital setting, a recovering patient might try to help care for a sicker one nearby. especially if the nurses were overstretched. And indeed, by the time of later plagues, it became a strategy to use convalescents, who had survived plague and presumably gained immunity, as attendants to the currently ill. This practice was noted in Milan and Venice, where those who had recovered were sometimes hired or expected to stay on and nurse others, since they were believed to be less likely to catch it again immediately. Thus, in the halls of the pest house, you might find a few walking survivors among the cots, performing simple acts of kindness, giving a cup of water to someone burning with fever, or covering the body of a shivering patient with a blanket. But for the staff, each death was double-edged. It meant one less patient to care for, a grim kind of relief in an overburdened environment, but it also meant one more risk-laden task to perform in removing the body. It was a constant reminder of their own fragile fate. The longer one worked in a plague hospital without falling ill, the more one might feel a mix of uncanny fortune and survivor's guilt. Some accounts from caregivers who wrote after surviving a plague describe an almost numb state they entered, a kind of emotional shutdown to cope with the horror. Yet not everyone succumbed to apathy. There are also stories of remarkable devotion, such as nurses who stayed by a dying patient's side to the very end, whispering prayers or simply offering human presence so that the victim would not die alone. Ultimately, in an era where family members could rarely be there at the final moment due to quarantine, the caregivers became the surrogate family for the dying. So let's talk about a bit of the perceptions on a societal level. The advent of plague hospitals marked a significant shift in how society dealt with epidemic disease. Of course, the Black Death wasn't the first plague that the world had suffered, but certainly the worst one to date. Initially, many people were suspicious or fearful of these institutions. You see, to be sent to a plague house might feel like a death sentence or even a form of exile. It's pretty understandable how people could feel that way. There are cases recorded where individuals resisted going, hiding their sick relatives at home to avoid the authorities, or even bribing officials so as not to be taken away, and the reluctance is very understandable. Once you entered those fever-ridden halls, you surrendered control of your entire life. Recognizing this, enlightened officials, as few as they were, realized that plague hospitals had to offer real care, not just a kind of detention, if they were to be effective, that is. An example of positive outcomes can be seen in Bristol, England, during the plague outbreak in 1666. The city established a well-organized pest house in a commandeered house known as the Forlorn Hope, which once again could have chosen a better name. In any case, the Forlorn Hope Pest House was run by a skilled surgeon assisted by physicians and supplied with food and medicine at city expense. It was noted that people were more willing to send their loved ones out there because they knew the sick would actually be looked after by proper doctors and decently trained nurses. Well, in that outbreak, Bristol suffered far fewer deaths, only about 0.6% of the population, a success attributed to the pest houses limiting the spread and caring for the afflicted apart from the healthy. After the crisis, the city even rewarded the chief surgeon, John Dunbar, with a substantial sum for his, quote, faithful service at the pest house in the time of infection to the great hazard of his life. Yeah, fair enough. He should get rewarded for that. Definitely a case of credit where credit is due. Well, this case illustrates how by the 17th century a plague hospital could be seen as a civic investment that saved lives. The plague hospital also became entwined with attitudes towards poverty and public welfare. Over time, authorities observed that plague hit hardest in overcrowded and impoverished districts. Plague was often perceived as a disease of the poor, partly because the poor had fewer means to flee, and lived in closer quarters with worse sanitation. Thus, measures against plague often doubled as measures against the poor. City councils would round up vagrants and beggars when plague threatened, sometimes expelling foreign beggars and gathering the local destitute into plague hospitals preemptively. This was done in part to shield the general public from contagion, but it also took on a moral dimension. By providing the deserving poor with shelter, food, and basic medical care in plague hospital, the authorities felt that they were fulfilling their role in Christian charity. Yet at the same time, they were enforcing social order by isolating the underclass. In places like Paris and Lyon, after major plague waves subsided, the buildings initially used as plague hospitals didn't always shut down. Instead, they were converted into general poorhouses or hospitals for the indignant. While the link between plague hospitals and poor relief grew quite strong. For example, the large plague hospital built in Paris in the 1580s was later turned into the permanent Hôpital Général, housing the poor with 2,000 plus people confined and fed there, out of sight, of course, in the years afterwards. Likewise, Lyon's plague hospital eventually became a charity workhouse, when plague was absent, that is. In this way, the plague hospital left a legacy in the development of European social institutions. What started as an emergency response to an epidemic evolved into a more general mechanism for caring for and controlling marginalized populations. And so from a medical history perspective, plague hospitals were a precursor to the infectious disease hospitals and quarantines of later centuries. They demonstrated an early understanding that isolation could curb an epidemic, and that state or community resources needed to be mobilized to care for the sick en masse. The fact that some plague hospitals achieved notable survival rates suggests that even without understanding the bacteriology, simple nursing care mattered the most. Fresh air, cleaning and feeding patients. These fundamental nursing interventions may have saved lives by supporting patients through the worst of the illness. The 45% survival at Marcel's hospitals in 1720, as recorded by contemporaries, was actually quite an improvement over the usual grim mortality of bubonic plague, which, rather than having a survival rate of 45%, had a death rate of 60 to 70. It's no wonder people just gave up, and there's certainly a psychological dimension when you get sick. If you give up and all the rest, it's not good for you. It can't be good for you. I've heard it somewhere. Someone will correct me in the comments, I'm sure. Well, it certainly indicates that later plague hospitals and pest houses were not just a place to go and die. You actually had a fighting chance if you went there. Now, culturally, the imagery of life and death in plague hospitals seeped into art and literature. There are paintings from later eras, like those by Michael Serre depicting Marcel's plague, or Goya's harrowing portrayal of a plague hospital, that show rows of victims and cowled doctors, visuals clearly informed by the experiences of these institutions. And of course that very word, lazaretto, has entered literature, notably in Alessandro Manzoni's novel The Betrothed, where the climax is set in the lazaretto of Milan during 1630, portraying a vast city of the sick, with suffering and miracles intermingled. Well, these accounts, whether they're fictional or not, they show both the despair and hope found in plague hospitals. Amid those dreadful conditions, there are moments of humanity, a reunion of loved ones, a penitent finding spiritual peace before death, a doctor discovering a newfound purpose, or simply just a poor patient, grateful for a loaf of bread and a clean bed. So we can say that life and death in a plague hospital certainly encapsulated the extremes of the human experience during one of history's greatest plagues, and I guess humanity's worst disaster. On the one hand, these hospitals were scenes of unimaginable suffering. It's very hard to describe it in words, the fever, the pain, the constant shadow of death, the pressure on the staff. The mortality was so high that at times the hospitals seemed just like waiting rooms for the grave, a kind of purgatory, with death carts coming and going in a grim procession. And you just imagine it, you've got your window that they've cracked out for ventilation, and all you can hear is those carts rolling by, thinking, when are they going to come for me? Certainly not very good on a psychological level. But on the other hand, within those walls we find these profound acts of courage, charity, and even nascent medical insight. Caregivers who chose compassion over self-preservation saved lives, and they've certainly earned their place in the historical memory. As for the patients who survived, they bore witness to the fact that even in the darkest times, recovery was very much possible. Now, the plague hospital was an early embodiment of the public health principle that society must care for its sick and contain dangerous illness in a collective way. It forced communities to organize and confront the plague, rather than simply collapse in panic. And so, through trial and tragedy, these institutions taught lessons: the value of isolation and sanitation, the importance of supportive care, and the need to balance fear with humanity. For all the bleakness that surrounded them, plague hospitals offered a glimmer of order within the chaos, a space where knowledge could be gathered, as Guy de Chauliac's observations were, and where the helpless could find a little bit of help. Focusing on Europe's plague hospitals, especially as born in the crucible of the Black Death, it gives us this deeper understanding not only of the medieval medicine structures and social responses, but also just the base human capacity to adapt in the face of catastrophe. Even in an era with no cure and barely any understanding of disease, people didn't simply just give up. They couldn't. They improvised a system, flawed as it was, cruel as it sometimes was, misguided as it usually was. They did their best to fight against the contagion and to care for one another. Not because they had really any hope, but just because it was the good Christian thing to do. The insights gleaned from this are enriched by vivid anecdotes: that lone survivor of an English hospital where everyone died, the Venetian boats ferrying corpses at night, the doctor in a beaked mask of later times bending over a patient, and the plaintive prayers echoing in a ward at midnight. Those are the images that remain as testaments to both the vulnerability and the resistance of humanity. The plague hospital was a place where life and death met to face off every day. And in the emptiness left by so many deaths, one can also find the seeds of modern healthcare, an early acknowledgement that society must organize to heal those who are weak. And in the stories of those who worked and suffered in those hospitals, there's an inspiration and caution in equal measure. Their world was very different from the one we live in. Yet the fundamental challenge, confronting a deadly epidemic, that remains relatable even today. Look at the last few years we've gone through. The uncertainty, the panic, even a lot of the silly and misguided decisions, some based in science, some based in knee-jerk reactions. And look at the aftermath we've faced. Certainly makes one ask questions. But we're not going to go into that, aren't we? In any case, studying how the medieval people managed to create pockets of care amid a sea of death. It's not just an exercise in academia, but it's a story of human fear, sacrifice, and that little flickering lamp of hope in the darkest of times. But it is one that we've talked enough about today, because that's the end of our time together. Unless you want to go watch another video, which you're welcome to do that. You can watch as many as you like. Now, you didn't get interrupted by any ads, didn't you? Pretty good, isn't it? That's why I'm going to read off the top tier patrons and supporters now. We got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Linda Reese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulford Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Jill, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tiflo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, and Alexa. Thank you so much. All right, and that's enough from me. Good night, lots of love to you all as always. Remember to wash your hands, and I will see you whenever you feel like coming back. Farewell for now.